All right, great. We talked about Matthew. Let's talk a little bit about Luke. I love the way that Luke opens. We get again birth narratives there. If all we had were Luke, if all we had was the Gospel of Luke, we wouldn't have magi, but we would have shepherds. If all we had was Matthew, we wouldn't have shepherds. We'd just have magi in our creche scenes. But we have shepherds, and I think that's critical for Luke because of the way for Luke that the gospel extends, especially to the marginalized, especially to the poor. I would say it's even interesting in Luke that rather than getting a sermon on the mount, we get a sermon on the plain. That Jesus seems to come down and enter into the places of lowliness and brokenness. But and I give you there the Gospel of Luke begins in political hopelessness. It's Luke where we get the taxation and no room at the inn, so that it begins with this kind of oppression by empires and the structure of Rome and people being pushed around and poor being marginalized. This is and Mary and Zechariah singing songs about God's justice and it's this decree from Caesar Augustus that causes people to have to be moved back and forth. And so it's really into that kind of brokenness, that kind of political turmoil that Jesus comes and this kingdom is established. But my favorite kind of introduction to what I think is the main themes in Luke is chapter 4, where Jesus goes to the synagogue. This is verse 16 of chapter 4. When Jesus came to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." We dealt earlier with the four Levitical codes of Israel. In particular, we dealt with this issue of tithing, gleaning, Sabbath, but then the sabbatical year, which then leads to that fourth major code, Leviticus 25, the year of Jubilee. In Isaiah, in particular Isaiah 61, the prophet picks up this idea of Jubilee, the year of the Lord's favor again. And this is where Jesus goes. He goes to Isaiah 61. He picks up this theme of the Lord's do-over, of the Lord's year of Jubilee, and these expectations that God would overturn all of the empires, would reset up justice, would take the lowly and bring them up and bring down the mighty, so that there would be this reorientation of life. And so Jesus shows up in Nazareth, shows up in the synagogue. They're all excited. Jesus is home, boobala, pinching his cheeks and inviting him to read the scripture for the day. And so he goes to Isaiah 61. He reads from the prophet Isaiah, and the way that synagogue life probably functioned is that Jesus reads from the scroll of Isaiah, and then he rolls up the scroll, gives it back to the attendant, and synagogue was more dialogical than kind of preaching today. So it was likely that Jesus was then called on to, after reading the text, to start the conversation. And rather than asking a question like, when do you think the year of Jubilee will come? And then we can have this debate, when the Romans are dead, and all those kinds of things. We can instead, he looks at them and says something they did not expect. Today, this is fulfilled in your hearing. And then after that, it's so strange. They're all excited about this. And they say, this is verse 22, they all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" Which ironically, we've just read 3 chapters in Luke and know that he's not actually Joseph's son. But this really has to do more than likely with this idea that he's from there. That this is our hometown guy. This is Joseph's son. If he's come to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and we've heard all these great things that he's been doing in Capernaum and other places, think of how much he'll do for us. And this is why he says, verse 23, he said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.'" So the proverb goes something like this. If you're a doctor and you get sick or your family gets sick, If you take care of people who aren't your family, how much more will you take care of yourself or your family? So if you've healed these people in other places where you don't belong, how much more will you take care of the people who you're with? But then he quotes a couple of Proverbs to him, and he said, "Truly I tell you, no prophet's except in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel at the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." So let me stop there for just a second. So he tells these two weird stories. Elijah, there were all sorts of people hungry and in need during the time of Elijah, but the only one that he took care of was a widow from Zarephath in Sidon, from a foreign people who didn't belong to us. That's who Elijah took care of. And there were all sorts of lepers in the time of Elisha, but the only one Elisha healed was the general of an enemy's army. Now, when they heard this, they were all enraged and filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. So think about this. He comes to proclaim the year of Jubilee, the year of the Lord's favor, a do-over, and they're all excited. Great, give it to us. We're ready. In fact, if you've done it for other people, how much more will you do it for us? But then he says, but here's kind of how God has operated. It's not been about us. It's been about, for Elijah, it was about this widow somewhere else, and for Elisha, it was about this general of a foreign army. So that this is kind of a strange text, but most scholars would argue what Jesus is doing is saying, listen, here's how Jubilee functions. If you want forgiveness and a do-over, you have to extend it to others. You can't just have it for yourself. That's not the way Jubilee functions. It's not forgiveness for you, but nobody else. It has to extend to others. It has to extend beyond these boundaries. That's what it means. And it's in Luke where we get even the teaching of the Lord's Prayer, to forgive us our debts, what? As we forgive our debtors. It's in Luke where we get these profound parables, like the prodigal son, which is really the parable of the older brother. The prodigal son is forgiven. Jubilee is pronounced over his life. But what happens is the older brother who's like, what are you talking about? I never got a party. But that's not the point. The point is for Jubilee, for the one who's been outside to be redeemed and brought back in. This is the challenge for the great parable where the man is forgiven the small debt by the king that he can't repay, the huge debt. He has this overwhelming debt that he cannot pay, but then the king forgives him. It's the year of Jubilee. The debts are canceled. But what happens? He goes out and he finds the neighbor who owes him a small debt, and he refuses to forgive the debt and holds him accountable. And then the parable says, well, what will the king do when he hears about the unforgiving servant? He'll put the debt back on. So there's this powerful idea of Jubilee, of transformation, of the breaking of boundaries, of the expanding of the gospel, of the way in which tax collectors and sinners and these parables all have to do with this kind of year of Jubilee. And I say there on the notes for you that the story of Christ then is extended on through Luke's second volume into Acts, so that we shouldn't be surprised then that the day of Pentecost opens up and the Spirit of God brings together all of these different people from all these different places. But the gospel then expands past these boundaries to Gentiles and to all of these unexpected people, to Ethiopian eunuchs, that it just keeps the year of God's redemption, the outbreak of God's redemption, and continues to break out beyond where we expect it to go. And this is such a critical part for Luke, and I think this is an amazing aspect of Luke's gospel, is God's justice, God's bringing together people who have been broken, and especially extending grace and redemption and transformation to those who've been placed on the margins. So this is really a critical part. So what I'd love for you to take just a few moments and discuss is both in Matthew and Luke. How does that relate then to us as the church? I mean, how do we take these themes these themes from Matthew of what it means for Jesus to be Son of God, not defined in terms of filling stomachs or even spiritual power or earthly power, but what it means to stand beneath the cross and say, truly, this is God's Son. How is that? How does that relate to our life today? How do we live that out? And for Luke, what do all these Jubilee themes mean for us as a church as well? So I'd love for you to just take a few moments and discuss that, and then I'll come back and talk a little bit about both John and about Mark. All right? Thanks.